The Alpha King ordered her execution. Moments later, he discovered she carried his only heir. The chains were too tight. Elena could feel them cutting into her wrists as the guards dragged her down the long stone corridor, her feet barely touching the ground. The cold air of the dungeon hit her face like a wall, and the sound of her own heartbeat was louder than the footsteps echoing around her. She had been in this castle for 3 days. She had spent all 3 of them in the dark, on a cold stone floor, with nothing but a thin blanket and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the walls. She had not slept, not really. Every time her eyes closed, her body pulled her back awake, sharp and alert, because somewhere deep inside her something was telling her to stay ready. She did not know what she was supposed to be ready for. She only knew that the moment she let her guard down was the moment everything would fall apart. The guards stopped walking. One of them yanked her upright, and she stumbled, catching herself just in time to avoid falling to her knees. She would not fall. She had promised herself that much. Whatever they threw at her today, she would stand through it. The doors ahead were enormous. Dark wood, iron handles, carved with the symbol of the Iron Moon Pack. A crescent moon split by a blade. She had heard about this symbol her whole life. Every pack in the territory feared it. Every Omega knew what it meant to stand before these doors. It meant you were already finished. It meant the verdict had been decided before you ever opened your mouth. The doors opened, and the light of the throne hall hit her like a wave. It was not warm light. It was cold and white, pouring down from high stone windows, cutting across the floor in long pale lines. The hall was enormous, more enormous than she had imagined, with ceilings so high she could barely see where the shadows began. The walls were lined with members of the royal court, dressed in dark colors, watching her with the kind of expressions that came from years of watching people just like her walk through those same doors. Their faces were still, curious, in the way that people are curious about something that does not quite feel real to them. Elena kept her eyes forward. She walked as steadily as she could, which was not very steady at all, given that her legs had been cramped for 3 days, and her wrists were held at an angle that made her shoulders ache. She focused on a point directly ahead and kept walking. The throne was at the far end of the hall. She had known it would be there. She had known, in the way that you know something you have been told about many times but never actually seen. But knowing it and standing in front of it were 2 different things entirely. King Calum Draveth did not look the way she had expected. She had expected someone older, someone with the look of a man who had been sitting on that throne for so long that the throne had become part of him, that the crown had become part of his face. She had expected something worn and heavy and tired. He was none of those things. He was perhaps 30, no more than that, with dark hair and a face that was entirely still. Not relaxed, not peaceful, but controlled, in the way that stone is controlled, that iron is controlled. He was watching her walk toward him, with eyes that gave nothing away. Dark eyes, the kind that watched and processed and revealed nothing in return. He had one arm resting on the arm of the throne. His other hand lay still in his lap. He was not leaning forward. He was not sitting back. He was simply present, the way a wall is present, and she had the sudden strong sense that this man had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. The guards stopped her 12 feet from the base of the steps. One of them pressed down on her shoulder, pushing her toward her knees, but she locked her legs and stayed standing. There was a soft murmur through the court. The guard pressed harder. She did not move. The king's eyes shifted, very slightly. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door that is not opening the way it should. A man stepped forward from beside the throne, tall, gray-haired, dressed in long court robes. He held a scroll in his hands and unrolled it, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough to fill the entire hall without effort. Elena Voss, of the Southern Greymere Pack. He read the name as though it were a foreign word, something he was not sure how to pronounce. Charged with illegal trespass upon Iron Moon's sovereign territory. Charged with theft of a royal border seal. Charged with resisting guard capture, causing injury to 2 royal sentinels. He rolled the scroll back up. These are charges that carry a single sentence under Iron Moon law: death. The word fell into the hall and stayed there. Elena did not blink. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment they put the chains on her. She had spent 3 days sitting with this exact word, turning it over in her mind, trying to make it feel real. It still did not feel real. It felt like something happening to someone else, and she was watching from a slight distance, slightly removed from her own body. The gray-haired man looked at the king. The king said nothing. He simply looked at Elena with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she looked back at him, and for a long moment nothing moved in that entire room. Then he raised 2 fingers, just 2 fingers, lifted from the arm of his throne. The gesture was so small it barely registered. But every person in that hall seemed to understand it instantly. "Execute her at dawn," he said. His voice was low, not quiet. It carried across the hall without effort, but low in the way that certain sounds are low, that carry weight simply because of how little effort they require. He said the words the way someone might say anything else, the way someone might say, "Close the window," or "Bring me water," without hesitation, without particular emotion, without any indication that the life he had just ended was a thing that required consideration. Elena felt the air leave her lungs in a single, slow exhale. She did not speak. There was nothing she wanted to say to this room, to these people, to this man on his stone throne who had looked at her for 30 seconds and decided she was finished. There was nothing she could say that would matter. She had understood that the moment the doors opened, this was not a place where words changed things. This was a place where things had already been decided, and the words were only ceremony. The guards took her arms again and turned her toward the doors. She let them. She walked back the way she had come, through the long, cold hall, past the rows of faces watching her go, and she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, and she did not look back at the throne once. She did not look back, because she did not trust what her face would do if she did. They put her back in the same cell, same stone floor, same thin blanket, same distant sound of dripping water. The door closed, and the lock turned, and she was alone again in the dark. She sat down on the floor, slowly, and pressed her back against the cold wall. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She breathed, in and out, slow and steady, until her hands stopped shaking. Then she pressed one palm flat against her stomach, gently, the way you press your hand against something fragile. She closed her eyes. She had been sick for 2 weeks before they caught her. A quiet, persistent sickness that came in the mornings and faded by midday, that left her tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She had ignored it for as long as she could, because she could not afford to be sick. Her village had been gone for 5 weeks at that point, and she had been surviving on her own in the forest, finding food where she could, sleeping in the most sheltered spots she could find. She did not have time to be sick. But the sickness had not gone away on its own. And after the 2nd week, she had stopped telling herself it was exhaustion or hunger or grief. She had stopped telling herself it was anything ordinary at all. She had not told anyone. There was no one to tell. The last members of her pack had scattered in different directions the night the attack came, and she had not seen any of them since. She was alone, and the secret was alone inside her, and she had carried it through 5 weeks of forest and cold and hunger and capture, and she had brought it into this dungeon with her, and she was going to carry it out of this dungeon with her tomorrow morning when the sun came up. She pressed her hand more firmly against her stomach. She had made a decision in those first early days, before the sickness even had a name she was willing to give it. She had made the decision quietly, in the same way she had made most of her decisions in the past 5 weeks, not dramatically, not with the weight of ceremony, but practically, because her circumstances were what they were, and certain things needed to be settled. The decision was this: whatever happened to her, this small, impossible, inconvenient, terrifying thing would be protected, not by anyone else, not by a system or a law or a person with power, by her, in the only way she still had the ability to protect anything, by staying quiet about it, by keeping it hidden, by not giving it to anyone who might use it for purposes she could not control. She had not known, when she made that decision, that she would end up in this dungeon. She had not known that the question of her own survival was going to become as urgent as it now was. But even now, with the king's voice still echoing faintly in the back of her mind, she did not regret the decision. If anything, the past 12 hours had only made her more certain of it. She would not give this to them. Not the truth of it, not the name of it, not the possibility of what it meant. She would take it with her, and that was all. She pulled the blanket tighter and tried to breathe slowly. Outside the dungeon, somewhere far above her, she could hear the faint sound of the castle settling into nighttime, the change of guards, the distant sound of footsteps on stone, the muffled sound of voices she could not make out, life going on, indifferent and ordinary, above the small dark room where she sat with her hand on her stomach, and her execution 12 hours away. She thought about her mother, briefly. Not with grief. She had already moved through the sharp part of that grief in the weeks after the attack. She thought about her mother the way you sometimes think about a warm room when you are standing outside in the cold. Not with longing, exactly, with something quieter than that. She thought about the border forest. The night she had stumbled into it, bleeding from her shoulder where a blade had caught her during the chaos of the attack, disoriented and exhausted, and certain that she was going to die alone in the dark between two territories. She thought about the way the trees had looked in the moonlight, the way the silence had felt after the noise and the fire and the panic of the village. She thought about the man who had found her. She did not let herself think about him often. It was a practice she had developed deliberately, the way you develop any practice that keeps you functional when you cannot afford to fall apart. She allowed herself to think about him, the way you allow yourself one careful look at something that will burn you if you look at it too long. He had come through the trees quietly, moving without sound, in a way that she had registered as dangerous before she had registered anything else about him. She had tried to push herself upright, to put some kind of distance between herself and whoever this was, but her shoulder had given out and she had gone back down, and she had looked up and found him crouching beside her. He had not been in any kind of uniform she recognized. He had worn a dark traveling coat, and no emblems, no markings, nothing that told her where he came from, or who he belonged to. He had examined her shoulder without asking permission, which had annoyed her even in the state she was in, and she had told him so, and he had looked at her with an expression she could only describe as surprised, like he was not used to being spoken to that way. She had not known what to make of him. He was not warm, exactly. He was not one of those people who radiated easy comfort, but he was careful. He was thorough. He bandaged her shoulder with the focused attention of someone who genuinely could not afford to do it wrong, and he did not talk while he did it, and she appreciated that more than she would have admitted at the time. They had sat in the forest through the night. She had not been in a state to move, and he had not attempted to make her. He had built a small, low fire, low enough to avoid drawing attention, she noted, and he had sat across from it from her and said very little, and she had said very little back, and somehow the silence had been the most comfortable silence she had encountered in weeks. He had asked her once, toward the end of the night when the sky was beginning to lighten, where she was trying to go. She had told him she was not sure, that she had a direction but not a destination, that the two things she had been moving toward, her pack and her home, were both gone, and she was still working out what came after that. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said that some things that appear to be endings are not actually endings, that some losses open onto territory that would not have been accessible otherwise. She had looked at him across the fire, and thought that this was either the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 5 weeks, or a piece of comfortable nonsense from a man who had never actually lost anything. She had not been sure which. She was still not sure. When the morning came, she had fallen into a light, exhausted sleep for less than an hour. When she woke, he was gone. There was no note, no explanation, just the cold remains of the fire, and her own bandaged shoulder, and the pale early morning light coming through the trees. She had not thought at the time to wonder who he was. She had been too focused on surviving. And by the time the sickness started, she had other things to consider. Now, sitting in this cold cell, with her hand pressed flat against her stomach, and dawn 10 hours away, she thought about that night in the border forest, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, how strange it was that the world had brought her here, that the woman who sat in this dungeon was the same woman who had sat beside that fire, that the secret she was carrying had begun in a forest between two territories, in the quiet company of a man whose name she did not know. She pressed her lips together. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She was not afraid, she decided. She was many things, but she was not afraid. She had made her choices, and she was at peace with them, and whatever came with the morning would come, and she would face it the way she had faced everything else, with her spine straight and her eyes forward, and no indication, not a single one, that anything in her was breaking. She tilted her head back against the cold stone wall and looked up at the ceiling in the dark. Above her, the castle was quiet. Somewhere in those same walls, in a room she would never see, King Calum Draveth was sitting in the silence of his own chambers, and his wolf, which had been still for 7 years, so still that he had almost stopped believing it was there at all, was awake for the first time since a night in the border forest, when the sky was beginning to lighten, and a woman with silver eyes had fallen asleep across from a dying fire. He did not yet understand why it was awake. He only knew that something had shifted when he saw her walk through those doors, and he did not know what to do with that feeling. So he did what he had always done. He set it aside, and he looked out his window, and he waited for morning. The night moved slowly. It moved the way nights always do in places where someone is waiting for something they cannot stop, one careful minute at a time, each one feeling slightly longer than the last. Elena sat with her back against the wall for a long while, and then she lay down on the thin blanket on the floor, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark, and she thought about things that were not useful to think about. She thought about the morning she had left her village for the last time, not knowing it was the last time, the ordinary sound of it, the fires that people were building for breakfast, the smell of wood smoke and cold morning air, the sound of children, somewhere she could not see. She had been going to the far edge of the packland to check on a small food store they kept near the tree line. She had taken the path she had taken dozens of times before. By the time she got back, it was already over. She did not let herself stay in that memory for long. She had learned, in the weeks since, that the memories that pulled her the deepest were the ones just before. The ordinary ones, the ones where nothing had gone wrong yet, the ones where she still had things she was expecting to return to. Those were the ones that could take her apart completely if she let them. So she pulled herself back, the way you pull someone back from the edge of something, gently but firmly. She thought instead about practical things. The cell door was iron, hinged on the outside, with a bolt lock. She had examined it the first day, out of habit. There was no way to open it from the inside without a tool she did not have. The window was a slit in the stone, too narrow for anything. The ceiling was solid. The floor was solid. She was not thinking about escape. She had thought about it and set it aside. Not because she lacked the will, but because she understood the territory. She was inside the most secure fortress in 5 territories, in the deepest part of its dungeon, with guards at intervals whose timing she had been able to estimate by their footsteps for the past 3 days. Even if she got through the cell door, she would not get far, and in her condition, far was not an option regardless. She pressed her hand to her stomach again, a habit she had developed without intending to. She was 7 weeks along, she estimated, maybe 8. She was not entirely sure. She had been careful about not calculating it too precisely, in the way that you avoid calculating things that will only make the weight of them heavier. But she knew the general range, and she knew what it meant in terms of the changes she was already feeling in her own body. The tiredness, the sensitivity to certain smells, the way her appetite had shifted, the way certain sounds seemed louder than they should. She was aware that these things were going to become harder to hide as time went on. She was aware that in a few more weeks, even the best attempts at concealment would begin to fail. She was also aware, in a completely separate and much colder part of her mind, that this was a fact that had ceased to matter as of approximately 3 hours ago, when a man on a black stone throne had raised 2 fingers. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had found, in the past 5 weeks, that self-pity was an emotion that cost too much and returned too little. She did not have the energy for it. She had the energy to keep breathing, to keep thinking, to keep making the next small decision, and that was about the full extent of what she had. So she breathed, and she thought, and she let the night move slowly around her. She fell asleep somewhere in the middle of it, which surprised her. She had not expected to. But her body made the decision without consulting her, the way it had been doing more and more lately, shutting her down, demanding rest whether she wanted it or not. She slept for perhaps 3 hours. She did not dream, or if she did not remember the dreams when she woke. She woke to the sound of the change of guards, footsteps in the corridor, a brief exchange of low voices that she could not make out, then silence again, and the new guard's steady footstep beginning its familiar rhythm. She lay still for a moment. Then she sat up slowly and pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the thin slit of the window. The sky was still dark on the other side of it, but not completely dark. There was a difference, a very slight difference, between the darkness of the middle of the night and the darkness just before morning, and she could see it now. Dawn was coming. She stood up. She folded the blanket carefully, which was a strange thing to do, she knew, but she did it anyway. She smoothed it, and set it on the floor, with a kind of quiet care that had nothing to do with the blanket itself, and everything to do with the fact that she needed to do something with her hands that was not shaking. Then she stood in the middle of the cell and breathed. She thought about the man in the forest again. She thought about his voice, which had been low and careful, and the way he had sat very still on the other side of the fire. She thought about the question he had asked her, "Where are you trying to go?" and the answer she had given, which was honest in the way that answers are only honest when you have stopped caring about what the other person thinks. She thought about what he had said in return. Some things that appear to be endings are not actually endings. She thought that this was looking very much like an ending. The cell door opened at the first true gray light of morning. The guard who entered was not the one she had seen before. He was broader, quieter, with the careful movements of someone who did this kind of work regularly and had long since stopped feeling strongly about it, one way or the other. He held the door open and looked at her. "Time," he said. She nodded. She walked to the door. She walked through it ahead of him, which was not what he expected, and he had to catch up, and she heard the slight adjustment in his footsteps as he did. She did not give him the satisfaction of being pulled. She walked. The corridor was dim. Other guards fell in around her as she climbed the stairs out of the dungeon level. She counted them automatically, 4 in total, which was 2 more than they had used to bring her to the throne hall, which told her something about how seriously they were taking this morning. Or perhaps it told her how little they were taking her. 4 guards for an Omega woman in chains who could barely move her wrists. She was not sure whether to find that insulting or not. The execution yard was at the east end of the castle grounds. She had not seen it before. It was a square space, paved in stone, enclosed on 3 sides by castle walls, and open on the 4th to the gray morning sky. There were witness stands along 2 of the walls, a requirement of Iron Moon law, she knew, that executions be witnessed by members of the court. The stands were sparsely filled, perhaps 20 people, dressed in their court attire, watching with the morning light on their faces. She looked at none of them. At the center of the yard stood a wooden platform, raised about 2 feet off the ground. On the platform stood the executioner, a large man in a ceremonial dark coat, who held the standard blade of office. Beside the platform stood the gray-haired court official she had seen in the throne hall, the one who had read the charges. He was holding his scroll again. Elena had the absurd thought that he carried it everywhere, that he kept it on him at all times, just in case. Above the yard, on a stone balcony overlooking the entire space, stood King Calum Draveth. She saw him before she reached the platform. She could not help seeing him. The balcony was directly ahead of her, and he was directly in the center of it, standing with the same absolute stillness she remembered from the throne hall. He was not dressed in court robes this morning. He wore a dark coat over his usual attire, and his arms were at his sides, and he was looking at the yard below him with that controlled, unreadable expression that seemed to be the only expression he owned. He looked at her as she walked across the yard. She felt his eyes on her the way you feel a cold draft, not imagined, specific, coming from a specific direction. She did not look away from him. She walked to the platform and climbed the 2 steps and stood on it. The court official read from his scroll. She did not listen. She had heard the charges already. They had not changed. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin up, and she looked at the sky above the balcony, rather than at the man on it, because looking at him required something from her that she did not want to spend. The official finished reading. He stepped back. The executioner moved into position. He was professional about it, efficient. She appreciated efficiency, even now. She put her hand, very briefly, flat against her stomach. Just for a moment. Just for a second of contact, a moment of her own private acknowledgement of the thing she was choosing not to say. Then she dropped her hand and looked straight ahead. The executioner raised the blade, and the world tilted beneath her feet. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no great sound. Her body simply decided, without consulting her, that it had reached a limit. The yard blurred at its edges. Her legs, which had held her through 3 days of dungeon and chains, and the walk across the stone yard, decided that they were done. She felt herself beginning to tip, and she tried to correct it, and she could not, and she went down. Not backward, not sideways, straight down, slowly, to her knees. She caught herself on her hands. The stone was cold and hard against her palms. She pushed back, trying to get upright, and found that she was shaking in a way that was completely outside her control. Someone was shouting. More than one person. She heard footsteps running across the yard, and the executioner stepping back, and voices speaking urgently that she could not fully track. She was trying to focus, trying to get her body to cooperate, but her vision was going in and out at its edges, in a way that it had never done before, and the cold of the stones was working its way up through her hands, and she was aware, with the detached clarity of someone watching this from slightly outside themselves, that she was not going to be able to stand up. Someone crouched beside her. Someone put a hand on her arm, not unkind, and spoke to her, and she heard the words but not their meaning. A healer, the uniform. She was aware enough to register that. A court healer, arriving as protocol required, to ensure that no prisoner died before the official sentence was carried out. She heard the healer's quick intake of breath. She heard the healer's voice, sharp and urgent, calling for assistance. She heard the footsteps of someone running. She heard the sound of guards moving, and voices rising, and a kind of controlled urgency spreading through the execution yard, like ripples from a dropped stone. And then she heard footsteps on the stairs of the balcony, fast, measured, and heading down. She was still on her hands and knees on the platform. She raised her head and looked toward the stairs, and she saw the court captain arrive at the base of the balcony stairs, move quickly to a figure descending toward him, and lean close. She saw, from across the yard, the king stop moving. She watched his face, at this distance, in this gray morning light, do something she had not seen it do in the throne hall. It did not do much. It was barely a shift at all. But something in the arrangement of it changed. Something went out of the controlled stillness of it, just for a second, the way a light flickers in a room, where everything else is perfectly steady. The captain stepped back. The king looked across the yard and found her, still on the platform, still on her knees, with the healer beside her, and the executioner standing well back, and the blade lowered to the ground. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke one word to the captain. She could not hear it. She was too far away. But she saw the captain turn immediately and give an order, and she saw 2 more guards come forward, not to take her back to the dungeon, but to help her up, carefully. And the court official was rolling his scroll, with the expression of someone who has never had to deal with this particular situation before, and does not quite know what the appropriate response is. The blade was not raised again. She let them help her up. She had no choice. Her legs were not cooperating, and she was not going to fight them over it. Not now. Not in front of this yard full of witnesses who were already murmuring among themselves with the barely contained energy of people who have just witnessed something completely unexpected. She stood on the platform and looked at the balcony. The king was already gone. She looked at the empty balcony, and breathed, and tried to understand what had just happened, and could not, and decided that the only thing she could do right now was let them take her wherever they were going to take her, and find out when she got there. They did not take her back to the dungeon. That, more than anything, told her that something had changed. The room they put her in was not a cell. That was the first thing she registered, the absence of the things that made a cell a cell. There were no bars on the window. There was a proper bed, with a mattress and clean linens. There was a chair, and a small table. The window was high and narrow, but it let in real light, actual gray daylight, and when she stood beside it she could see a slice of the inner courtyard below. She stood at that window for a long time after the guards left her and the door closed behind them. She listened to the sound of the bolt being drawn on the outside. That, at least, had not changed, and she looked down at the courtyard and breathed, and tried to organize her thoughts into something useful. The thoughts were not cooperating. She knew what the healer had found. She had known it was a possibility, in the abstract way that she had known many things over the past 7 weeks, known them while also holding them at arm's length, because actually letting them land completely would have required more capacity than she had. She had known that her condition would eventually become impossible to conceal. She had simply not expected the timing. She moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave under her, which was such a stark contrast to 3 days of stone floor, that she had to sit very still for a moment just to absorb it. The healer had not spoken to her directly. She had not explained anything, had not told Elena what she was going to report, or to whom. She had only looked at Elena with an expression that mixed surprise and something more careful and complicated. And then she had spoken to the captain in a low, urgent voice, and then everything had moved very quickly in the way that things move when important information has just arrived in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elena folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and tried to think clearly. They knew. That much was settled. Whatever had been private was private no longer, and there was nothing she could do about that. The question was what came next, and that was a question she did not yet have enough information to answer. She thought about the king's face on the balcony, the way it had changed when the captain spoke to him, the way the stillness in it had shifted for just that single moment. She had been watching him from across the execution yard, so she could not be certain of what she had seen. But she had seen something, and the fact that she was in this room rather than back in her dungeon cell told her that whatever the captain had said had mattered, that the word the king had spoken had changed the morning. She did not know what to do with that. A knock at the door surprised her. Not the sound of a bolt, but an actual knock, 3 short raps on the wood. She looked at the door and said nothing. After a moment, the door opened. A woman entered, young, wearing the practical uniform of the castle household staff. She was carrying a tray with food on it, real food, not the flat bread and water of the dungeon, and a clay cup of something warm. She set the tray on the small table without making eye contact. "The head healer will come in an hour," the woman said. "You are to eat and rest before then." She said it quickly, like someone repeating instructions given to her, not looking for a response. She left before Elena could say anything. Elena looked at the tray. She was hungry. She had been hungry for 3 days on dungeon rations, and the smell of the food on that tray was doing something unwelcome to her resolve, which was already under considerable strain. She stood up, crossed to the table, and sat down. She ate slowly and carefully, because she had learned that eating too quickly in her current state produced results she would prefer to avoid. The food was plain but good. Bread, real bread, and a thick soup, and some kind of soft cheese. She ate most of it. She drank the warm drink, which turned out to be a slightly bitter herbal blend that she did not recognize, but that left her feeling less unsteady than she had before. Then she sat and waited. The hour moved the way hours move when you are waiting for something unknown. She stayed at the table. She kept her hands flat on the surface in front of her, not folded in her lap, not moving, just present. She looked at the window. She looked at the door. She thought about the king. He had been in that forest. She did not know this consciously, not as a fact she could prove. But something had been happening in her since she walked into the throne hall and looked up at him on his throne. Something that had started as the faintest thread of recognition, and had been growing ever since, silent and persistent, the way a vine grows through a crack in a wall. It was not his face exactly, because she had not seen his face clearly that night. It was something more fundamental than a face. Something about the way he held himself, the way he was still, the way he watched her walk across the hall with those dark eyes that gave nothing away. She had told herself in the dungeon that it was fear making her see things that were not there, that she was in a desperate situation and her mind was reaching for explanations that gave her some kind of connection to the power in this room, that it was a delusion born of 3 days in the dark. She sat in this room with the gray light coming through the high window, and she looked at her own hands on the table, and she admitted, for the first time, only to herself, that she did not think it was a delusion. The healer arrived exactly when promised. She was older than the one who had been in the execution yard, white-haired, steady-eyed, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. She came in with a younger assistant and a carrying case of supplies, and she looked at Elena with a directness that Elena found, unexpectedly, easier to bear than other kinds of looking. "I'm going to ask you some questions," the healer said, setting her case on the table. "You don't have to answer them, but I would encourage you to, because the accuracy of my report to the king depends on the accuracy of the information I'm given." Elena looked at her. "Your report to the king?" "Yes." "And what will that report contain?" The healer pulled a stool to the other side of the table and sat down. She looked at Elena steadily. "What I can determine from this examination, how far along, your general condition, any complications I can identify." She paused. "Nothing else. I report medical facts. I leave interpretation to others." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 7 weeks. "Maybe 8. The healer nodded and began her examination without further comment. She was thorough and professional, and she explained what she was doing as she did it, and she did not fill the silence with unnecessary talking, which Elena appreciated. The examination took about 20 minutes. When it was over, the healer put her instruments away and looked at Elena with an expression that was entirely neutral, in the way that neutrality is sometimes the most honest expression available. 8 weeks, she said. You are healthy, overall, given the circumstances. The faintness this morning was likely stress and inadequate nutrition. She paused. You should rest. You should eat regularly. The next several weeks will determine a great deal. Elena looked at her. About what? About a number of things, the healer said. She closed her case and stood. She looked at Elena for a moment, with that steady, unhurried gaze. I will say only this, because it is a medical observation and not advice. Whatever position you find yourself in over the next few days, the worst thing you could do for yourself, or for the child, is to continue in the posture of someone who has already accepted that they are finished. That posture takes a physical toll. She picked up her case. Rest now. She left. Her assistant followed. The door closed. Elena sat at the table in the gray light and turned the healer's words over in her mind. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, as she had taken to doing. The faint stirring of something, not movement, not yet, but something, that she sometimes felt when she did. She thought about the king. She thought about the border forest. She thought about the quiet fire, and the careful hands, and the voice that had said some things that appear to be endings, are not actually endings. She thought about the way his face had changed on the balcony, just for that 1 second, just for that small, barely visible moment. She pressed her hand more firmly. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She was not sure what was coming. She was not sure of almost anything, but she was in a room with a real bed and real light and food in her stomach, and there was a bolt on the door but no blade raised over her head, and that was a different situation than the one she had been in 3 hours ago. That much was simply true. She lay down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling. She let her eyes close. Somewhere on the other side of this castle, she imagined, the king was being given a report. Numbers and facts and medical observations delivered in a neutral voice. She imagined him sitting very still, in whatever room he was in, the way he had been still on his throne, the way he had been still on the balcony. She imagined him absorbing the information with that controlled, unreadable expression. She imagined the very slight shift that she had seen on his face on the balcony, barely a shift at all, happening again. She fell asleep before she could imagine anything more. When she woke, the light through the window had changed. It was later in the afternoon, the light lower and warmer. She lay still for a moment and listened to the castle around her. Footsteps. Distant voices, the ordinary sounds of a place going about its daily life, indifferent to the small earthquake that had happened inside its walls that morning. She heard footsteps stop outside her door. She heard a pause, long enough to be deliberate. Then the footsteps moved away again, and the corridor was quiet. She lay still and looked at the ceiling and breathed, and she thought that whatever was going to happen next was going to happen very soon, and that when it did, she would need to be completely, absolutely steady. She could do steady. She had been doing steady for 8 weeks. She could keep doing it. She pressed her hand one more time to her stomach, gently, privately. Then she sat up, swung her feet to the floor, and started preparing herself for whatever came through that door. The knock came just after sundown. It was not the knock of household staff. There was a difference, in the weight of it, in the deliberateness of it, between someone delivering a tray and someone who did not need to knock at all, but was choosing to. Elena was sitting at the small table when she heard it. She had been sitting there for the better part of an hour, having given up on sleep, and decided that stillness was the next best option. She looked at the door. She said nothing. The door opened. King Calum Draveth stepped into the room alone. No guards, no advisor, no court official with a scroll, just him, in a dark coat, closing the door behind him with a quietness that managed to make even that small action feel like a decision. He looked at the room briefly, as people do when they enter an unfamiliar space, and then he looked at her. He pulled the chair from beside the bed and set it across the table from her and sat down. She did not move. She did not speak. She watched him settle into the chair with the same controlled stillness she had observed from across the throne hall, and she thought, he looks different in a room this size. Larger rooms do certain things to certain people, make them look powerful, or make them look distant. This room was small enough that she could see him properly for the first time, and what she saw was a man who was neither one thing nor the other, not the iron tyrant of the courtroom, not something softened or approachable, something more complicated than either of those. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back at him without speaking. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and she had come to value honesty above comfort. "Are you well?" he said finally. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, this was not among them. She looked at him steadily. "That seems like a strange question, given the morning." He received this without any visible reaction. "Answer it anyway." She considered. "I am functional," she said. The healer saw to that. He nodded once. He was quiet again for a moment, his eyes on hers, and she had the clear sense that he was doing something he did not often do, which was choosing his words more carefully than usual. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "You are the king," she said. "I imagine you ask most things directly." "Not always." He said this simply, without defensiveness. "But this, yes." He set his hands on the table, not folded, just resting. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," she said. "I know who you are." "Did you know before they brought you into the throne hall?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the border forest. She thought about the dark traveling coat, and the absence of any emblem or marking. She thought about the careful hands bandaging her shoulder, and the low, unhurried voice, and the quiet fire, and the conversation that had moved between them through a long night, like something looking for its shape. "No," she said. "Not until yesterday." He was quiet. He looked at his hands on the table, and then back at her. "Then you understood this morning, when they brought you in, who I was?" "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No." He leaned back very slightly in the chair. It was not quite a lean. It was the smallest possible shift away from perfect stillness. Why? She had thought about this question. She had been thinking about it all afternoon, knowing it was coming, knowing she needed to decide what version of the truth she was willing to give. She had decided, eventually, that there was only one version available to her, which was the full one. "Because it would not have changed anything," she said. "Not the way you were looking at me, not in that room, with those people watching. You had already decided." He did not deny this. "And after? When you were in the dungeon, you could have called for a guard. You could have asked to speak to someone. You could have found a way to get the information to me." "I could have," she agreed. "But you chose not to." "Yes." He looked at her. His expression had not changed, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted. "Tell me why." She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had brought into the throne hall, the same steadiness she had stood on the execution platform with. She said, "Because I did not want my child to be raised as a political instrument by a man who orders executions before breakfast." The silence that followed those words was absolute. She heard the castle around them, distant and indifferent, and she heard her own breathing, and she heard nothing from the man across the table. He sat completely still. He was looking at her in a way that she could not fully read, not with anger, not with cold calculation, but with something that had more texture than she expected, something that took longer to process than anger would have. When he spoke, his voice was level. "You believed I would use it that way. I believed you would not be given a choice about using it that way," she said. "Whether you wanted to or not. That is what courts do with information like that. That is what power does with things it can use." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "And if you had been wrong?" "Then I would have been wrong," she said. "It would not have changed the decision I made with the information I had." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. Whatever he was seeing in her face, she let him see it. She had nothing left to hide behind, and she had discovered, over the past 3 days, that the absence of things to hide behind was in some ways a relief. She was simply herself, in a small room, across a table from the most powerful man in 5 territories, and she was too tired and too clear-eyed to be anything other than exactly what she was. He stood up. The movement was sudden enough that she registered it before she had time to stay still, and she felt her body tense slightly in response. He did not come toward her. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the dark outside. She watched his shoulders. They were very straight. She thought, unexpectedly, about the way he had sat across the fire from her in the forest. That same straightness, that same quality of weight being carried without comment. He turned back to face her. "You will stay in this room," he said. "You will be moved to better quarters tomorrow. You will not be harmed." He paused. "Neither will the child." She looked at him. "That is not the same thing as being safe," she said. He looked back at her with something she could not name. "No," he said, "it is not." He held her gaze for a moment longer. "I know that." Then he turned and walked to the door and put his hand on the handle. He stopped there for just a second. She was not sure he was aware of it. His hand on the handle, and his head slightly lowered, and something in the set of his shoulders was different from the controlled perfection of them when he had entered. Something had shifted in him. She was not sure what. She was not sure she was supposed to see it. Then he opened the door and was gone, and the corridor was empty, and the door swung closed behind him. Elena sat at the table and looked at the closed door for a long time. She pressed her hand to her stomach. She breathed. She thought about what he had said, not the words themselves, but the gap between them. The thing that sat between you will not be harmed, and I know it is not the same thing as being safe. She thought about the fact that he had acknowledged the gap. That was not the response of a man who was purely calculating. She did not know what it was the response of, but she was paying attention to it. She thought about his face when she had said what she said, when she had told him exactly why she had stayed silent, the thing that had happened in his expression. Not anger, not even quite surprise. Something harder to name than either of those. Something that looked, in that flickering moment, like recognition. She was not going to read into that. She was not going to build stories from it. She had lived too long in difficult circumstances to let herself reach for comfortable stories. She was going to take what was in front of her, which was this. She was alive. The child was safe. A man who had ordered her execution that morning had sat across a table from her that evening and told her he knew that safety was more than the absence of threat. And he had looked, for just that one moment, like a man who understood the difference from the inside. That was what she had. It was not much, but it was real, and real things, she had discovered, were worth holding on to. She stayed at the table until the candle on it burned low. Then she went to the bed and lay down and pulled the clean blanket over herself and looked at the ceiling in the near dark. She thought about the border forest one more time, the dying fire, the pale morning light in the trees, the way he had gone very quiet when she told him she had a direction, but not a destination. She thought about what it would mean if she was right about him. She thought about all the ways she could still be wrong. She closed her eyes. Above her, somewhere in the high corridors of the castle, she imagined the king walking back to whatever room was his. She imagined him sitting down in it. She imagined him being very still and very quiet, and thinking about things he had no good way to organize, in the way that people think about things when the shape of something has changed so fundamentally that all the existing structures for understanding it have become inadequate. She did not know what he was going to do next. She did not know what she was going to do next. But she was here, and so was he. And the morning was not what it had promised to be, when she stood on that platform and pressed her hand to her stomach for what she had believed was the last time. That was enough to sleep on. The morning after brought a different kind of silence to the Iron Moon Castle. It was not the silence of a place that had simply moved past something. It was the silence of walls that had absorbed something significant and were still vibrating faintly with it. The servants moved through the corridors with a particular kind of careful energy, going about their work, eyes straight, voices low. The kind of energy that spreads through a place when something has happened that everyone knows about but no one has been officially told. Elena noticed it in the woman who brought her breakfast. The woman was not unfriendly, but she was precise, in a way that previous interactions had not required of her. She set the tray down and said what she needed to say, and left, and Elena noticed the brief glance at the door before she left, and the extra care with which she pulled it closed behind her. By mid-morning, Elena had been moved. 2 guards and the same young woman from before came for her and walked her through a different part of the castle, not the dungeon, not the route she remembered from the throne hall, but an interior corridor she had not seen, stone and torchlight giving way to paneled wood and the light of proper windows. They stopped at a door on the 2nd level, and the young woman opened it and stepped back, and Elena walked in. The room was almost uncomfortably better than what she had been in before. It was 3 times the size of the previous chamber, with a proper window that looked out onto the inner garden, a garden that was brown and spare in the late season, but a garden nonetheless, with a stone path and the bare skeletons of what must, in spring, be something worth looking at. There was a fireplace, already lit, and the warmth of it after the chill of the corridor made Elena stop in the doorway for just a second. There was a proper wardrobe, a writing table with paper and ink, which she looked at with a kind of surprised consideration. A full-length mirror on the inside of the wardrobe door, which she avoided looking at directly, because she was not yet ready to confront whatever she looked like after everything. She crossed to the window and looked out at the garden. She stood there for several minutes. She heard the door close and did not turn around. Then, after a moment, she did turn, and found that she was alone. She moved through the room slowly, taking its measure, noting the bolt on the outside of the door. Still there, because whatever had changed, she was still a prisoner, and she was not foolish enough to forget it. The window latch was functional, and she noted that too. The fireplace had no other exit. The wardrobe contained a change of clothing, simple, practical, in her size, that she looked at with a complicated feeling. She changed. The clothes she had been wearing for 4 days had been through enough that removing them was a relief, even in these circumstances. The new ones were plain, dark trousers and a simple blouse, a wool overcoat that hung to her knees, but clean and warm and very much preferable to the alternative. She stood in front of the mirror for exactly 2 seconds, registered that she looked thin and pale and remarkably steady given the events of the past week, and closed the wardrobe. Then she sat in the chair nearest the fire and waited. She did not have to wait as long as she expected. Lord Brennan arrived before noon. He was the gray-haired court official she had seen in the throne hall and the execution yard, and he came with a younger aide who carried a writing case and sat near the door in the way of someone preparing to take notes. Lord Brennan himself sat across from her in the other chair near the fire. He had his scroll with him. She was beginning to suspect the scroll was structural, that it did something for him, a prop he needed to function. He looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had been managing complicated situations for a long time, and had learned to be very systematic about it. "My name is Lord Brennan," he said. "I serve as the chief advisor to King Calum. I am here with his knowledge and his instruction." "All right," Elena said. "I have some questions for you." "All right," she said again. He asked the questions. They were practical, thorough, and not unkind. He asked about her pack, its location, its size before the attack, who had led it. He asked about the attack itself, what she had seen, what she had heard, from which direction it had come. He asked about the border seal they said she had stolen, and she explained what had actually happened, that she had found it in the forest, near where the attack had begun, discarded as though dropped in haste, that she had picked it up not to steal it but to use it as evidence of where she had been, in case she needed to explain her presence in that area. She had not anticipated that the seal itself would be the charge. Lord Brennan listened without expression. His aide wrote. Elena answered each question as plainly as she could, because she was tired of the weight of things she had not said, and because the only currency she currently had was honesty. When the questions ran out, Lord Brennan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the scroll in his hands, and then he looked at her. "The king has instructed me to inform you," he said, "that the execution order has been formally revoked. The official record will show that new evidence emerged pertaining to your case. This is accurate, but it is also, in practical terms, the most manageable explanation available." He paused. "You understand what this means?" "It means I am not to be executed," Elena said. "Yes, but I am also not to be released." He did not confirm or deny this. He said, "Your situation is not yet formally defined. The king is considering the matter." He rolled the scroll slightly tighter in his hands. "I would advise patience." "I have been patient," Elena said. "I had a lot of time to practice it in the dungeon." Lord Brennan looked at her for a moment, with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, a brief shift in the controlled surface of his expression. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you did." He stood. His aide stood and closed the writing case. He looked at her one more time. "You are free to move within this wing of the castle, escorted, between the hours of morning and evening. If there is anything you require, you may ask the household staff who attend this corridor. They have been instructed to assist you within reason." "Within reason," Elena repeated. "Within reason," he confirmed. And there was something in the way he said it that was almost, though she would not have bet her life on this, something almost like apology. He left. The aide followed. The door closed. Elena sat in front of the fire and thought about what Lord Brennan had said, and what he had not said, and she thought about the king considering the matter, and she tried to imagine what it looked like, in practice, for a man like that to consider something. She could not quite get there. She thought about his hands on the table the night before, just resting, flat, nothing performed about it. She thought about the aide writing down her account of the attack on her village. She thought about the border seal, and how she had explained it. She thought about Lord Brennan's face when she mentioned the direction of the attack, the way something had shifted very briefly in his expression. Not much, but enough for someone who was paying attention to notice. They were interested in the attack. That was clear. More interested than she had expected. She had assumed she would be a minor detail in whatever their actual concern was, but the questions about the attack had been specific, and the aide had written them down with particular care, and Lord Brennan had not moved on from that section of questions quickly. She did not know what that meant. She had no basis for interpreting it, but she filed it away. She spent the afternoon moving through the narrow wing of the castle she was permitted to inhabit, escorted by a guard who was quiet and unobtrusive in the way of someone doing a job they have no strong feeling about. The wing was modest, 3 rooms and a connecting corridor, nothing grand, but it had windows that looked in 2 different directions, and she stood at each of them for a while, looking out at the castle grounds, orienting herself in the geography of this place. Knowing where you were mattered. It had mattered in the forest, and it mattered here. By evening, she was back in her room. The fire was maintained. Another meal arrived. She ate it, and sat at the writing table, and looked at the paper and the ink for a long time without touching either of them. She was not going to write anything. She had nothing to write that she would be comfortable with anyone else reading, and she had no one to write to regardless. But she sat at the table, because the act of sitting at a writing table was the act of a person who intended to continue existing in a way that required plans, and that felt like something she needed to remind herself of. She thought about the king again. It was becoming a habit. She could not decide if that was dangerous or simply realistic. She thought about the way he had looked standing at the window in her previous room, his back to her. The straightness of his shoulders, which she now understood, was not just posture but something he did instinctively, the way some people close their hands tightly around things without realizing. The brief pause when he had his hand on the door, the single second when something in the set of him had shifted. She kept coming back to that second. She could not let it alone. She thought about the forest. She thought about him crouching beside her on the ground, examining her shoulder with that focused, careful attention. She thought about the question he had asked, "Where are you trying to go?" and the particular quality of silence that had surrounded it, as though it were a question he was asking partly of himself. She thought about what kind of man takes off every marking that identifies him and rides alone into a border forest at night. A man who is hiding from something, or a man who is trying, for one night, to find out who he is when he is not being watched. She thought those might not be entirely different things. She pushed back from the writing table and went to the window. The garden below was dark, the stone path barely visible. She looked out at it for a while, at the skeleton shapes of the bare bushes and the single stone bench near the center. She heard footsteps in the corridor, slow, measured. She recognized the rhythm of them before she had consciously processed how she knew it. She stood very still at the window. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She counted. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then they moved on, and the corridor was quiet. She breathed out slowly. She looked at the garden below. She pressed her hand against her stomach, automatically, without thinking about it. She thought, he stopped. She thought, that is a different thing from passing by. She did not build anything on top of that thought. She simply held it, the way you hold something small and unexpected in your open hand, and looked at the dark garden below, and breathed. She went to bed early that night. She was tired, in a way that was becoming familiar. The specific tiredness of her condition, deep and unavoidable, pulling at her from the inside. She lay down in the proper bed, under the proper blanket, with the warmth of the fire in the room, and she stared at the ceiling for precisely as long as it took her mind to stop spinning, which was not as long as it had been the night before. Progress, she thought. Small, strange, uncertain progress. She closed her eyes, and somewhere in the corridors of the Iron Moon Castle, a king was walking back the way he came, with his hands at his sides and his expression controlled, and something in his chest, doing something that 8 years of discipline had not entirely prepared him for. The first time they had a real conversation, it lasted 22 minutes. Elena knew this because she had been watching the light change through the window, and she had a good internal sense of time, a skill developed over 5 weeks of forest survival, when knowing how much daylight you had left was a question of practical importance. She had been sitting at the writing table with the untouched paper in front of her when the knock came, and she had said come in, and he had come in, and she had not been entirely surprised. He took the same chair he had used before, across the table from her. He did not pull it out with any ceremony. He simply sat down in it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Lord Brennan spoke with you," he said. "Yes. He told me your account of the attack, of the border seal." He paused. "I want to hear it from you directly." She told him. She gave him the same account she had given Lord Brennan, with the same plain attention to detail, the direction of the attack, the specific area of the packland where she had found the seal, what it had looked like when she found it. She watched him while she spoke. He listened without interrupting, and she noticed that he did not look away from her face, which was a specific kind of listening she had learned to notice, because it was relatively rare. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The seal you described," he said. "The markings on the back." 3 small scratches, she said, like someone had marked it to identify it. Not official, personal. He was quiet again. Not the blankness of someone who had nothing to say, but the specific quiet of someone processing something that had just connected to something else. "Who attacked your village?" he asked. "I did not see the leaders clearly," she said, "but the markings on the weapons, the shields some of them carried, I recognized them afterward, when I was in the forest, trying to understand what had happened." She looked at him. They were from the Heir territory. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A slight tightening around the eyes, a quality of attention that sharpened in a way she could feel even across the table. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain about the markings," she said. "I cannot be certain about the rest." He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked back at her. "Lord Harrow and I have a treaty," he said. It was not a defensive statement. It was information, delivered flatly, as though to see how it landed. "I know," she said. "I know who Lord Harrow is. And you are telling me that his people attacked your village." "I am telling you what I saw," she said. "The conclusion is yours." He looked at her steadily. She met his gaze. The fire between them was warm, and the room was quiet, and she was aware that she was sitting across a table from the Alpha King, of the most powerful pack in 5 territories, telling him something that directly challenged a political arrangement he had likely spent considerable effort maintaining, and she felt entirely calm about it. She did not know where that calm was coming from. She suspected it had something to do with having been at her own execution that morning, and come back from it with her sense of scale permanently rearranged. He said, "How do you know about Lord Harrow?" "Everyone in the outer packs knows about Lord Harrow," she said. "He has been expanding his territory for 4 years, slowly, one small pack at a time. Nothing large enough to be a formal conflict, just enough to keep the smaller packs too small to push back." She paused. "My pack was not the first." "No," he said slowly. "It was not." She looked at him. "You knew." "I knew that packs in the Harrow border region were losing ground," he said. "I did not have confirmation of the source." His jaw was slightly tighter than it had been. She noticed these small changes. She was getting better at reading them, which was something she found both useful and complicated. "The treaty was signed because I needed something Harrow could provide. It did not mean I trusted him. It meant he had access you were not giving him otherwise," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not with displeasure, with something that was closer to recognition. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what it meant." They sat with that for a moment. "What will you do?" she asked. She was aware this was a question she had no right to ask. She asked it anyway, because she wanted to know, and because she had a stake in the answer that she could not fully calculate, but could feel the weight of. He said, "I am going to find out whether what you are telling me can be confirmed through channels I control." He looked at her steadily, "And then I am going to deal with it." She believed him. She was not certain she should believe him. She believed him anyway. The 22 minutes ended with him standing, and moving toward the door, and stopping just before he reached it. He turned back. He looked at her across the room. She was still sitting at the table, her hands flat on the surface. He said, "In the forest. 8 weeks ago." It was not quite a question, but it was also not a statement. It was something balanced between them, open, waiting. She looked at him. She said, "Yes." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded, once, and opened the door and left. Elena sat at the writing table for a long time after that. She pressed her hands flat and stared at the paper, and let the fact of the last 22 minutes settle over her. The conversation itself, the information, the border seal, Lord Harrow, was important. She understood its importance, but it was not what was sitting in her chest, with the particular weight of something that needed attention. He had confirmed it, not with emotion, not with any of the things she might have expected or feared. Simply, yes, the forest. 8 weeks ago, he had confirmed it the way he seemed to do most things, with complete directness and without waste. She thought about what that meant. She could not quite arrive at the end of that thought. It was too large to arrive at in one sitting. She picked up the pen. She held it over the blank paper for a moment. Then she put it down again, and went to stand at the window, and look at the dark garden below, and breathe. One thing at a time. She had always been good at one thing at a time. The thing right now was that she was alive, and the child was safe, and the man who had ordered her execution had just confirmed, in the quietest possible way, that he was the man in the forest, and that he had known it from the moment he saw her walk into his throne hall. She pressed her hand to her stomach. She breathed. She thought that whatever came next, it was going to require both of them to be braver than they currently looked like they were capable of being. She thought that might be all right. She thought that people sometimes surprised themselves. She went back to the table. She picked up the pen again. She held it over the paper. She wrote one line. I had a direction but not a destination. Then she looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded the paper and put it in the drawer of the writing table, and sat back in her chair and looked at the fire. Outside in the corridor, the castle was quiet. Somewhere in those same walls, in a different room, a man was sitting with his hands on his desk, and his eyes on the middle distance, and his wolf was more awake than it had been in 8 years, and he was trying to decide whether the thing that had been growing in his chest since the morning he saw Silver Eyes walk through his throne hall was something he could afford to let alone, or whether it was the kind of thing that grows whether you tend it or not. He sat with that question for a long time. Then he reached for the file on his desk, the file on Lord Harrow, which Lord Brennan had put together at his request, quietly, without formal record, and he opened it and began to read. The file on Lord Harrow was thorough. Lord Brennan did not do things incompletely. Over the next 2 days, Calum read it in sections, setting it aside only when the demands of court required him to be present, and picking it back up the moment he had the room to himself again. He read it with the particular kind of focus that came from information confirming a suspicion he had been deliberately not allowing himself to act on, because the political cost of acting on an unconfirmed suspicion was not one he could afford. It was confirmed now. The evidence was not dramatic. It was the kind of evidence that accumulates over a long time in small pieces, each piece individually explainable as coincidence or misfortune, the pattern only visible when you laid them all out together and looked at them honestly. 3 Omega packs in the outer Harrow border region gone in 4 years. Trade routes through their former territories now controlled by Harrow-aligned merchants. A border seal that turned up in a burned village where it had no legitimate business being. Timing, consistently, that corresponded to moments when Harrow's financial reserves were under pressure. Calum set the file down on the second evening, and sat with his hands pressed flat on his desk, and thought about the treaty. He thought about the thing the treaty had given him, the access, as Elena had said, that he was not willing to offer otherwise. He thought about how much it had cost him, and what he had believed he was buying. He had not been deceived about what the treaty offered. He had understood what he was trading. He had chosen to make the trade, and he had done it with clarity. What he had not known, what he would not have permitted himself to know, he understood now, because he had not wanted to pay the price of knowing, was the specific use to which the space created by that treaty was being put. He thought about a small southern pack and a woman dragged from the forest into his dungeon, and the 4 days of her life that he was directly responsible for. He was not a man who indulged in guilt. He had not survived the past 7 years by being the kind of king who sat with the weight of every consequence. But this was not abstract. He had held it at a distance for 3 days, and it kept refusing to stay there. He called Lord Brennan the following morning, and told him to begin the formal process of treaty review. Not dissolution, not yet. Review, which was technically within his rights, and created no formal conflict, but which sent a message clear enough to anyone paying attention. Lord Brennan had looked at him over the file with an expression that contained multitudes and said, "Of course, Your Majesty," and that had been that. The morning after, Calum went back to Elena's room. He did not announce himself in advance. He knocked once and waited. She said, "Come in," and he entered. She was standing at the window this time, looking at the garden. She turned when he came in, and he had the same experience he had every time he entered a room she was in. The sense of something in him adjusting itself, settling, the way the internal compass of a ship corrects for a current it has entered. He pulled the chair to its now usual position and sat. She came away from the window and sat across from him. "I have begun the formal review of the Heir Treaty," he said. She looked at him. "That was quick." "It was not quick," he said. "It was 7 years late, and I am aware of that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What will you do about the packs that have already been lost?" He had been thinking about this. "There are some things that cannot be undone," he said. "What can be done is to ensure that the territory is recognized as abandoned under illegal circumstances, which creates a different set of legal conditions than standard territorial dissolution." He paused. "It is not enough, but it is more than what currently exists." She nodded slowly. She was looking at him with that particular quality of attention she had, entirely present, giving nothing away, absorbing everything. He was beginning to understand that this was not a defensive posture. It was simply how she engaged with things. She thought before she responded. She looked before she spoke. It was so different from the court, where everyone was performing before they even had a thought, that he had to recalibrate slightly each time. "You said you are aware that it was 7 years late," she said. "Yes. What happened 7 years ago?" He looked at her. It was a question that no one in his court would ask him. It was a question that required a certain kind of courage, or a certain kind of recklessness, and he was not yet sure which she had. He suspected both, in proportions that shifted depending on the circumstances. He considered not answering. It was within his right not to. Everything was within his right. That was, he had come to understand over the past week, simultaneously the most and least useful thing about being who he was. He said, 7 years ago, I lost my father and my brother in the same season. The pack was not prepared for me to take the throne at the time I took it. I was not prepared for it either." He kept his voice level. It was information. He was delivering it as information. The first 2 years were spent establishing the kind of authority that prevents internal challenges. The kind that requires a different set of choices than the ones you make when you are operating from a position of strength. He looked at the fire beside them. "The choices I made in those years were effective. They were also not always the choices I would make now." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of choices?" "The kind where the calculation is, this will cost something real, but it will cost less than the alternative." He looked back at her. "You understand that kind of calculation?" "Yes," she said. "I have made it." "Then you understand that you can make it correctly and still find, later, that the accounting was incomplete." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what happened with Harrow?" "Yes," he said, "among other things." She was quiet again. He watched her process this. He had not expected to find himself telling her any of this. He had come to update her on the treaty review, because it seemed relevant to her situation, and because she had asked the right questions, and he had given himself permission, over the past 48 hours of sitting with the file, and the accounting of the past 7 years, to give her honest answers. He was not sure when that permission had been granted, or precisely what it was based on. He only knew that it felt necessary in a way he was not in the habit of questioning when something felt necessary. "You are telling me this," she said, "because you want me to understand how you ended up in a position where something like the Harrow situation was possible." "I am telling you this," he said, "because you asked me a direct question, and you deserve a direct answer." She looked at him for a long moment. "You do that a lot," she said. "What?" "Give me more than I asked for." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I am aware of that." "Why?" He looked at her. He thought about the border forest. He thought about 8 weeks, and a woman with silver eyes, and the specific quality of the conversation that had moved between them through that long night. Honest in a way that things rarely were. Loose in a way that things rarely were. Not because either of them had tried to make it that way, but because neither of them had been in a position to perform anything. Because this is the first time in a long time that I am speaking to someone who will tell me if I am wrong, he said. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully name. Not pity, not surprise, something quieter than either. And have I told you? She asked. That you were wrong? Yes, he said, twice. You were right both times. She was quiet. Then, very slightly, something shifted in her expression. The same, almost not quite thing he had been noticing and cataloging over the course of their conversations. Not quite a smile. Something warmer than the rest of her face, and brief enough that if he had not been watching carefully, he would have missed it. What happens now? She asked. To my situation. I have been considering that, he said. And? I need more time to consider it properly. She looked at him. How much time? I am not sure, he said honestly. She nodded slowly. She looked at the fire. He looked at the side of her face in the firelight, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head with that habitual straightness that he recognized as something learned rather than something given, something she had decided on. He thought about the execution platform. He thought about her on her knees on the stone, and the guard pressing on her shoulder, and her not moving. He thought about what it costs to hold yourself that way, when everything around you is moving toward a conclusion you cannot change. He said, before he had fully decided to say it, you did not deserve what happened in this castle. She turned to look at him. He held her gaze. No, she said, I did not. I know that, he said. I know you know that, she said. The knowing is not the same as the undoing. No, he said. It is not. They sat with that for a moment. The fire settled. The room was warm and quiet. He stood, eventually, as he always seemed to be doing, standing to leave, leaving to think, returning to speak, and then standing to leave again. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle, which was also becoming habitual in ways he was not entirely sure what to do with. He looked back at her. She was watching him from the chair. I found you in the forest because I was already there, he said. I had gone on my own. I did not plan to be there. She looked at him. I know, she said. I figured that out. He nodded. He looked at her for one more second. Then he opened the door and left. Elena sat in front of the fire and put her hand on her stomach, and breathed, and thought about what it meant that this man, this very specific, very complicated, very controlled man, had volunteered that information unprompted, that he had told her not because she asked, but because he needed her to know, that he had stood with his hand on the door handle, in the specific way of someone who is not quite ready to leave a conversation behind, and said something that cost him something, and then left. She thought about the border forest. She thought about his voice in the dark, saying some things that appear to be endings, are not actually endings. She thought that she was beginning to understand what he might have meant by that. She sat with the fire and breathed, and outside the window the garden was bare and brown in the late season, and in the rooms and corridors of the Iron Moon Castle, something quiet was growing, that had no name yet but that both of them could feel, the way you can feel weather changing before you can see it in the sky. The days that followed moved in a rhythm Elena had not expected. They were not comfortable days. She was still a prisoner in any practical sense, still reliant on the castle's permission for every aspect of her daily life, still sleeping in a room bolted from the outside. But they had a shape to them, a pattern that she found herself organizing around with the practical adaptability she had developed in the forest, when you learned quickly that having any structure at all was better than the alternative. Mornings were her own. She ate, she moved through the small wing she was permitted, she stood at the window, and watched the castle grounds come awake. She was learning the rhythms of the place, the change of guards, the movement of household staff, the small distinctions between a busy day and a quiet one. She was learning these things the way she learned everything, without announcing that she was learning them, just absorbing the patterns and storing them away. Afternoons were when visitors came. Lord Brennan came twice more, with follow-up questions about the Harrow territory and the attack, each time with his aide and his scroll, and each time with a slightly more visible quality of respect in his manner, that she noted but did not comment on. The head healer came every third day, practical and unhurried, checking on Elena's health with the same measured professionalism as before. A woman named Clara from the household staff had been assigned specifically to Elena's wing, and she was the closest thing Elena had to companionship. Not talkative exactly, but present, and occasionally willing to answer questions about the castle, with the careful discretion of someone who was aware that her answers were going to be considered. The king came in the evenings. Not every evening, but enough evenings that it became a thing she found herself oriented toward without fully planning to be. He would knock, wait, enter, sit in the same chair, and talk with her in the same way, directly, without preamble, without the performance that she suspected saturated every other conversation he had in a given day. They talked about the Harrow situation as it developed. They talked about the Outer Pacts, about the history of the territory, about the specific structures of Iron Moon law that govern situations without precedent. He talked about these things the way someone talks when they are thinking out loud, not asking for advice exactly, but thinking better when the thought was given words in front of someone who would engage with it honestly. She engaged honestly. That was the one thing she had to offer that apparently no one else in this castle was providing, and she offered it without restraint. She told him when she thought he was wrong. He told her when he thought she was missing context. They argued, sometimes, in the careful way of two people who are not sure yet what the rules of their arguing are, feeling out the boundaries, testing whether disagreement would destabilize the thing between them, or whether it would hold under that pressure. It held. One evening, he came later than usual. She had been sitting at the writing table, and she was actually writing this time. Not anything intended for anyone else, just the kind of notes you make to order your own thinking, scraps of observation and calculation that helped her see her situation more clearly. She covered the paper when he came in, not because she was hiding anything significant, but because she was not ready to share what was on it, which was a distinction she thought mattered. He noticed the covering of the paper. She saw him notice it. He did not comment. He sat down. He looked tired, not in an obvious way. His posture was still exact, his expression still controlled. But she had been watching him for 2 weeks at this point, and she could read the difference between his normal stillness and a stillness that was costing him something. "What happened today?" she said. He looked at her. "What makes you think something happened? You look like someone who has been very precise all day, and is now running out of precision," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Lord Harrow's response to the treaty review arrived this morning. She waited. "He denied everything," Calum said, formally, in writing, with the full apparatus of official correspondence. He suggested that any evidence of his force's involvement in border activity was fabricated by parties who wished to destabilize our treaty. He implied that those parties might be within the Iron Moon castle itself. Elena looked at him steadily. "He implied you." He was careful not to be direct about it, Calum said, "which is how he does things." "And your court?" "My court is divided," he said. It was a sentence that clearly cost something. Some see this as sufficient reason to proceed. Others are concerned about the implications of dissolving the treaty without more formal evidence. Others are concerned about what it signals to other treaty partners. He looked at the fire, and some are concerned about other things entirely. "About me," she said. He looked at her directly. "Yes." She looked back at him. "They think I am a manufactured crisis," she said. "That my presence here is inconvenient, in a way that serves someone's interest." "Some of them," he said. "Yes." "Are they wrong?" He looked at her for a moment, that stretched slightly longer than usual. "No," he said. "Your presence here is inconvenient. It is also not manufactured. Both of those things are true at the same time." "You are sure of the second part," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "I am completely sure." She believed him. She continued to find that belief complicated, and continued to hold it anyway. She said, "Then the question is how to handle the court." "Yes." "Do you usually handle your court by explaining yourself to them?" "No," he said. "Then what is the plan?" He looked at her with an expression she had come to associate with him arriving at something he had already worked out, but was choosing how to present. "The plan," he said, "involves formalizing your situation, giving it a definition that the court can process rather than speculate about." He paused. "What form that definition takes is what I have been considering." She looked at him. "And what have you considered?" "Several things," he said. "I want to ask you something first." She waited. He said, "What do you want?" She looked at him. The question was so simple, and so direct, and so unlike anything anyone in this castle had asked her, that she found herself without an immediate answer, for perhaps the first time in their conversations. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the fire. She looked back at him. "I want to be somewhere my child is not a weapon," she said. "I want to be somewhere I have some control over my own situation. I want—" She stopped. She was surprised to find that finishing the sentence was harder than starting it. She breathed. "I want to stop surviving and start living. I have been surviving for 8 weeks, and I am very good at it, but I am tired of it being the only thing I am doing." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was very still, in a different way than usual. Not the controlled stillness of the court, but a quieter kind. He said, "I can offer you safety. I can offer you a defined role in this castle that gives you standing. The court cannot simply disregard." He paused. "I cannot promise everything else you want. I am not sure I know how to promise it." She looked at him. "I did not ask you to promise it," she said. "I asked you what you had considered." He looked at her steadily. "I have considered that the best thing for the child is not separation from the throne," he said. "It is proximity to it, with protection attached to that proximity. I have considered that the best way to achieve that is through a formal arrangement." He looked at his hands. "I have also considered that formal arrangements can be made and unmade, and that what actually determines whether this child is a weapon or not is not a title but a decision. A decision about what kind of king I am going to be, and what kind of world this castle is going to be." Elena was very still. He looked at her. "I have been making that decision for the past 2 weeks," he said. "I wanted you to know that." She breathed, slowly. She pressed her hand, quietly, to her stomach under the table. She looked at him for a long moment, at the firelight on his face, and the careful stillness of him, and the thing she had been noticing for 2 weeks, that was growing steadily more impossible to call anything other than what it was. She said, "You went to the forest, to find out who you were, without the throne." He looked at her. "And then you came back," she said, "and you have been trying to figure out how to be both people at once, ever since." He was very quiet. The fire settled beside them. The room was warm. He looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it at all, just the direct, unguarded look of someone who has been seen. "Yes," he said simply, "that is exactly right." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. She said, "Then that is what we are going to do. Both of us. Figure out how to be both people at once." She paused. "Together." The words sat between them. He held her gaze. Then he nodded, once. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a ceremonial thing. It was simply a nod, from one person to another, in a firelit room, in the castle where he had ordered her execution 3 weeks ago. It was the quietest possible form of agreement. It was enough. The castle's stillness before dawn had a particular quality that Clara had tried to describe once to her mother in a letter. How everything felt larger in those hours, colder, more honest. She had been a household servant in the Iron Moon Castle for 6 years, and she had never stopped noticing it. The way the corridors held secrets more loosely in the dark, the way the stones themselves seemed to exhale something they had been holding all day. She was thinking about this in the hall outside Elena's wing, when she nearly walked into Lady Mara's aid. The woman, sharp-faced, middle-aged, always dressed in the pressed utility of someone who served ambition rather than comfort, stopped just as suddenly. They looked at each other. Clara noted the hour. She noted the direction the aide had come from. She noted the piece of paper the aide was folding and tucking into the inside of her coat, with a speed that suggested she would have preferred not to be seen doing it. "Early morning for you," Clara said pleasantly. "And you," the aide returned. Her voice was even. She had excellent control. Clara had noticed that about her in the 7 months she had been in the castle. She was a woman of excellent control. They went their separate ways. Clara continued to the kitchen, where she collected Elena's breakfast tray and walked it back up the corridor. She did all of this at her usual pace, with her usual face. She set the tray down on the small table outside Elena's door and stood there for a moment with her hand on it, thinking. Then she picked the tray back up and walked past Elena's door and down the corridor in the other direction, to Lord Brennan's private office, where she knocked twice and waited. She explained what she had seen. She explained it plainly and in full, without embellishment. which she understood was the only version of information Lord Brennan was interested in. He listened without expression. He asked 2 clarifying questions. He thanked her and told her she could go, and she went. And she delivered Elena's breakfast tray 20 minutes late, and said nothing about the delay. Elena looked at the slightly cooled tray, and looked at Clara, and said nothing either. She ate. By mid-morning, Lord Brennan had brought what Clara had told him, together with 3 other pieces of information he had been gathering separately for the previous week, and the picture that emerged from those 4 pieces together was considerably clearer than any of them had been on their own. He brought it to the king before noon. Calum read the document Lord Brennan put in front of him, with a steadiness that did not change as he worked through it. He had been prepared, in a general sense, for something like this. He had not been surprised to learn that his court contained people who were working actively against Elena's situation in the castle. He had known this from the first day. What the document in front of him now provided was the specific architecture, who was involved, what they had been doing, and crucially, the document that the aide had been seen with, and that had subsequently been found in a place it should not have been. The document was a letter. It bore the formal seal of Lord Harrow. Calum set the file down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Lord Brennan. "Lady Mara," he said. "Yes," Lord Brennan said. "How long?" "We believe the correspondence began before Elena arrived in the castle," Lord Brennan said. "Harrow's response to the treaty review arrived 2 days after Elena gave you her account of the attack. We think the letter was composed before he had any official knowledge that the treaty was under review. He knew through Lady Mara's network." Calum was quiet. He looked at the fire in his office. He thought about the timeline, the order of events, the specific timing of Harrow's formal response, the manufactured precision of it. He thought about the fact that Elena's account had been given in a room he had believed was private, and that it had apparently not been as private as he believed. He thought about what Harrow knew, and when he had known it. He thought about Lady Mara's daughter. He thought about the arrangement Lady Mara had been anticipating for the past 3 years, the arrangement she had been moving her daughter toward, building alliances, managing circumstances, all in service of the very specific outcome she had been investing in. He thought about what Elena's presence in the castle represented to that investment, and what Lady Mara had been willing to do to protect it. He thought about Elena in the throne hall. He thought about what it must have looked like to the people in that hall. An Omega, from a minor destroyed pack, brought in chains, with no advocates, no title, no claim to anything. He thought about how easy a target that was, how completely unprotected, how invisible her actual significance would have seemed to a court that measured significance by things you could display. He felt something in his chest that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it, and considerably colder. "Summon Lady Mara," he said, quietly. "To my private study, not the throne hall." Lord Brennan nodded. "And find out where her aide is," he said. "I want to know her current location." Lord Brennan nodded again, and left. The king sat alone in his office for precisely 4 minutes. Then he stood, and he walked down the corridor to Elena's wing, and he knocked on the door. She opened it herself this time. She had taken to doing that, moving the chair to be able to hear the approach and standing before the knock came, because she had always disliked being caught sitting down when something was about to happen. She looked at him and read his expression and said, "What happened?" He told her. He gave her the relevant facts in order, without commentary, because she would draw her own conclusions, and he did not need to manage that for her. He watched her face as he spoke. She absorbed it with the same particular stillness she brought to all incoming information, but something moved behind her eyes when he got to the Harrow letter, a specific kind of movement that was not surprise but confirmation, as though something she had been watching from a distance had arrived at a position she had expected it to reach. When he finished, she said, "Lady Mara was preparing her daughter for your heir." "Yes." "And Harrow knew about my presence in the castle through Lady Mara's network." "Yes." She looked at him. So when his formal response accused parties within the castle of fabricating evidence against him, he was describing the network he had built within the castle, Calum said. "Not mine." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He has been using your court against you." "For at least a year," Calum said. "Possibly longer." She looked at him steadily, and Lady Mara allowed it because she believed he would protect her interest in her daughter's position. "Yes. That is a significant miscalculation on her part." Yes, he said, it is. She looked at him. What are you going to do? He said, I am going to handle it. She held his gaze for a moment. She said, I know you will handle it. She paused. What I am asking is whether, in handling it, you are going to do it in a way that makes things better, or in a way that merely makes them even. He looked at her. He considered this. He thought about his first instinct when Lord Brennan had put that file in front of him. The cold, specific kind of anger, and what it had wanted to do with itself. He thought about the difference between those two things she had named, making things better, making them even. Both, he said finally, in the right order. She looked at him for a long moment, then she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Tell me your plan. He came in. He sat down. He told her. The conversation lasted an hour. It was the longest conversation they had yet had, and it was not the conversation he had planned to have when he had walked down the corridor. He had planned to inform her and leave. He had not planned for her to immediately identify the weakest part of his approach and spend 20 minutes dismantling it with quiet, methodical precision until he acknowledged that she was right and adjusted the approach accordingly. He had not planned to find himself, at the end of the hour, with a better plan than the one he had arrived with. He stood to leave. He stopped at the door. This too was becoming a habit he could not quite break. He turned back. I want to move formally in the next few days, he said. The announcement I mentioned. She looked at him. The formal arrangement. Yes. He paused. But I want to ask you something before I do. She waited. He said, will you have any part in how it is announced? Any preference about the terms? She looked at him for a long moment. This was a question no one had asked her. Not Lord Brennan, not the healer, not Clara. The question of what she wanted from the terms of her own formal situation had been, in the castle's approach to her, largely irrelevant. He was asking it with the directness he brought to everything, which meant he actually wanted to know. She said, I want it to be the truth, not a manageable version of it, not something shaped for court comfort. If you are going to announce it, announce what it actually is. He held her gaze. And what is it actually? She looked at him. She thought about the border forest. She thought about the fire, and the quiet, and the long night, and the morning light in the trees, and the 8 weeks that had followed, and the dungeon, and the execution platform, and the room with the fireplace, and the evenings, and the conversations, and the hour they had just spent. Something real, she said. Whatever else it is real. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was very quiet, and very unguarded in the way she had only seen it become in this small room, away from everything else. Yes, he said. It is. He nodded once. He opened the door. Down the corridor, Lady Mara was waiting in his private study, unaware of the content of the file on his desk. In the outer territories, Lord Harrow had received a formal treaty review notice and was calculating his next move. In the castle kitchen, Clara was making a cup of tea and thinking about the pre-dawn corridor and the folded paper, and being very quietly glad she had gone to Lord Brennan when she did. And in a small room with a garden window and a lit fireplace, Elena stood with her hand on her stomach, and her spine straight, and her eyes on the closed door, and she breathed, and she thought about something real being enough to start with, and she thought that this was true. It was enough. The announcement was made on a Thursday morning, which Elena did not know was significant until Clara told her, quietly, while bringing her breakfast, that Thursdays were the days the king traditionally used for formal declarations that concerned matters of the pack. It was a small piece of context that she tucked away alongside the other small pieces she had been accumulating, building a picture of this place and its rhythms from the inside out. She was not invited to the announcement. She had not expected to be. She heard about it from Clara afterward, in careful language that told Elena the woman had been thinking about how to relay it. The king had addressed his full court that morning. He had revoked the execution order on formal record, with a full legal accounting of the errors in her original trial, the procedural failures, the inadequate examination of evidence, the misidentification of the border seal as theft rather than recovered property. He had then announced that Elena would remain in the castle under royal protection for the duration of her pregnancy, and that the child she carried was the king's acknowledged heir. Clara relayed this with the expression of someone who had spent many years understanding that big events and small rooms were different environments, and that what mattered in each was not always the same. Elena listened. She looked at her untouched breakfast tray. She said, "How did the court receive it?" Clara considered. "Some of them well," she said. "Some of them very quietly." "And Lady Mara?" Elena said. Clara paused for a fraction of a second that told Elena everything. "Lady Mara was not present," she said. Elena looked at her. "Where is she?" "She departed the castle yesterday evening," Clara said. "Her household left with her. There was no formal announcement about her departure." Elena nodded slowly. She thought about Caleb's plan, as she had helped him shape it in the hour they had spent together. She thought about the phrase, making things better in the right order. She thought that Lady Mara's departure before the announcement, rather than arrest after it, was probably the right order. A scene in the court would have fed the narrative Heir was trying to build. This was quieter, cleaner, more damaging to Heir's network, in the long run, than anything dramatic would have been. "And the court's response to the rest of it?" she said. "The heir." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think they are still deciding what they think." "That seems about right," Elena said. She spent the morning in her room. She was aware that the announcement had changed the nature of her position in the castle, in ways that would take time to become practical. That the corridors she could walk down, the interactions available to her, the shape of her daily experience would shift, and that the shift would not be immediate, but gradual, like a tide. She was not impatient about this. She had learned to think in terms of tides. He came in the afternoon this time, not evening. The shift in timing felt deliberate, and when he sat down in the chair he looked like a man who had been in formal court all morning, and was now sitting in the only room in the castle where he was not required to perform anything. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well enough," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means that the people who were going to resist it were not in a position to do so publicly this morning," he said. "It means the formal record has been corrected. It means the heir is acknowledged." He paused. "It means there will be quieter forms of resistance over the coming months that I will need to manage as they emerge." "Such as?" "Questions about your standing. About the child's legitimacy in the context of pack law. About whether a formal arrangement should be documented." He looked at the fire. "Pack law has not dealt with this specific situation before. There are going to be people who look for the gaps in that." "And what are you going to do about the gaps?" she said. He looked at her. "Close them," he said simply. She believed him. She said, "What do the gaps require?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. He said, "They require decisions that I cannot make unilaterally. About what the formal arrangement actually is. About what I want it to be." She held his gaze. "What do you want it to be?" He said, "More than what pack law requires. Less than what I can promise in terms I have the right to promise right now." He was choosing each word carefully, which was itself information. "I want us to find the version of this that is true, in the way you said, and I want to build from there." She looked at him steadily. She thought about what building from there meant in practice. She thought about the past 2 weeks, and the firelit room, and the 22-minute conversation, and the plan they had shaped together, and the word real that had sat between them the evening before. She thought about what she had told herself in the dungeon, that she did not want this to be a political instrument. And she thought about the distance between that position and the one she was in right now, and she thought that the distance was not as large as she had feared, and not as small as she might have hoped, and that perhaps that was where real things tended to live. "All right," she said, "build from there." He nodded. He stayed in the chair longer than usual that afternoon. They talked about smaller things for a while, about the garden below the window, which he told her would look entirely different in spring, about the castle's history, about the specific pack traditions of the Iron Moon territory that she had no context for, and that he explained with more patience than she expected, given that they were traditions he had grown up with, and had probably not had to explain from the beginning for a long time. She asked questions. He answered them. He asked her about Greymere territory, the landscape of it, the size, the way they had organized their pack life, and she told him, and she found that talking about it, about the ordinary details of the ordinary life that she had lost, was different from the way it had felt before. Less sharp. Not healed exactly, but less raw. She did not know if this was time or context or something else. She did not analyze it too carefully. At some point in the conversation, without either of them marking it, they had both shifted slightly in their chairs. leaning marginally forward, the way people do when they have been talking long enough that the distance between them has stopped being the right distance. He noticed it, she thought, at the same moment she did. He did not move back. Neither did she. The afternoon light through the window changed while they were talking, shifting from the bright, cold light of midday to the lower, warmer light of late afternoon, and eventually he looked at the window and seemed to register that more time had passed than he had intended to spend. He stood, she stood, which she did not usually do when he left, and was not entirely sure why she did it this time. They were closer to the same height standing than sitting, she noted. He was taller, but not by much. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the firelit room was warm and quiet around them. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For the past 2 weeks," he said. "For how you have handled this." She thought about the dungeon. She thought about the execution platform. She thought about the folded paper in the writing table drawer. She thought about the way she had pressed her hand against her stomach in the dark, and decided, over and over, that she was not finished. "You were not easy to handle," she said. Something in his face shifted in the almost not quite way she had been cataloging for 2 weeks, warmer than everything around it, brief enough that you could miss it. She did not miss it. "No," he said. "I was not." He moved toward the door. He stopped, not at the door this time, not with his hand on the handle. He stopped before that, halfway across the room, and turned back. He said, "I would like to come tomorrow." She looked at him. "You come every day," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am asking whether you want me to." She held his gaze for one long moment. She thought about the forest and the fire, and all the distance between then and now, and the very specific fact of being asked. "Yes," she said. "I want you to." He nodded once. He went to the door, and opened it, and left, and the corridor received him, and the castle continued to turn around its own axis, and Elena stood in the middle of her room, with the fire warm behind her, and her hand pressed flat against her stomach, and she breathed, and she was alive, and the world had not stopped. The winter deepened. The castle grounds went white with the first snowfall in late November, and Elena stood at her window and watched it come down, and thought that this was the first snowfall she had watched from inside a building in nearly 3 months, and let herself acknowledge that this mattered. The small things mattered. She had made a practice of noticing them. The shape of her daily life had changed in the weeks since the announcement. Not dramatically. She was careful about dramatic changes, had learned to be cautious about things that shifted too quickly, because things that shifted too quickly in her experience often shifted back. But the practical architecture of her days had expanded. She could move through more of the castle now. She ate in a proper dining room rather than her chamber. She had access to the library, which she used every morning before breakfast, taking books that she brought back to her room and read in the evenings when the light was good. She had met more of the court. Some of them had come to her deliberately, in the careful way of people managing their own positions, coming to acknowledge her presence because it was clearly now necessary to do so, and better done early. She had received each of them with the same plain steadiness she brought to everything, neither performing warmth nor performing indifference, simply being present and honest in the way that she was. A few of them she thought might eventually become something close to allies, if she was patient about it. Most of them were simply managing their own interests, which she understood, and did not hold against them. Calum came every evening. This had become the fixed point around which the rest of the day organized itself, though she was careful not to let herself lean on it too heavily. She had been careful about leaning. She had been too well taught by recent experience about what happened when you built your stability on things outside your own control. But she let herself appreciate it. She let herself appreciate the specific quality of those evenings, the directness of the conversations, the way they had both continued to build honesty into the habit of each other's company, the growing ease of sitting in the same room, without needing to fill every silence. She let herself appreciate that he kept coming. That was not nothing. She had learned to notice when something was not nothing. One evening in early December, he arrived at his usual time, and she could see immediately that something was different. Not wrong, or at least not in a way she could identify as wrong. Something different in the way he sat down, the way he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. He said, "I have spent today with my legal counsel, reviewing the specific structures that govern the formal arrangement between us. She waited. "There are several options," he said. "I want to explain them to you, and I want your opinion on each of them." He paused. "And then I want to ask you something that is not about the legal structures at all." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me the legal structures first." He told her. He was thorough and precise, which she had come to expect. And she listened carefully, which he had come to expect. The options ranged from the most minimal, a formal acknowledgement of the child with no change, to her personal standing, to a full recognized bond, which pack law was very specific about, and which would require a ceremony, and would carry consequences in terms of her standing in the pack, that were significant and irreversible. She asked questions. He answered them. They talked through the implications of each option with the methodical attention they both brought to important things, and by the end of it, she had a clear understanding of the landscape they were looking at. Then she said, "And the thing you want to ask, that is not about the legal structures." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her. He was doing the thing he sometimes did, choosing his words with the specific care of someone who did not want to perform this, who wanted to say exactly what he meant, and nothing decorative on top of it. He said, "I want to know whether you can see a future in this castle that is something you actually want, not something you are making the best of, not something you have chosen because the alternatives were worse." He looked at her steadily. "I want to know whether this, specifically, is something you would choose." She looked at him. She thought about the dungeon. She thought about the execution platform. She thought about the border forest, which was where every line of thought seemed to originate, the fixed point around which everything else was organized. She thought about the fire and the question he had asked, "Where are you trying to go?" and the answer she had given, and the quiet that had followed it. She thought about the past 6 weeks. She thought about the specific experience of being in a room with this man evening after evening, building something from the raw materials of honesty and disagreement and careful listening, building it the way you build things, when you have learned not to rely on anything that cannot bear weight. She thought about the way it felt to have someone ask her what she wanted. She thought about the way it felt to be someone whose answer to that question mattered. She said, "Yes." He looked at her. She said, "Not because the alternatives were worse. Because this." She looked at him directly. "Because you." He was very quiet. The fire beside them was warm, and the room was still, and outside the window, the snow was coming down, and the garden below was going white. He reached across the table. Not quickly. He moved with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, slowly, giving her the full time to see the movement and decide what she thought about it. His hand rested on the table, open, not reaching for her hand, just there, available. She looked at his hand for a moment. She looked at his face. She put her hand in his. His hand closed around hers, carefully, warm, real. They sat there for a long time, neither of them speaking, and outside the snow kept falling, and the garden went quietly white, and the fire was the only sound in the room, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The child was born on a morning in early spring, when the garden below the window had just begun to show the first pale colors of the season, small and determined things pushing through the cold ground, the kind of growth that had been coming for a long time underground before it was visible above. Elena had been awake since before dawn. She had been awake through most of the night, which she had spent in the way you spend a long night that requires everything from you, focused, quiet, doing the work, not complaining about the work. The head healer had been with her, and 2 assistants, and Clara, who had offered to stay, and whose presence Elena had found steadying in a way she had not anticipated. Caleb had been in the room at the start. She had told him, at some point in the early hours when the specific demands of the night had made it impossible for her to manage his presence, and also manage everything else, to wait outside. He had gone without argument. She had heard his footsteps in the corridor through the night, not pacing exactly, but present, steady, not leaving. When the healer placed the child in her arms, Elena was very still for a long moment. The child was warm, dark-haired, with the specific dark of someone who was going to be darker still as they grew, and eyes that were still the soft, unfocused gray of newborns, but that she looked at with the private certainty of someone who already knew what they were going to become. Small and complete and here, in her arms, real. She breathed. Clara went to the door and said something, and the door opened, and Caleb came in. Elena heard him come in, and heard the door close, and heard him cross the room. And she did not look up immediately. She looked at the child. She gave herself one more moment of this. Just this. The weight of it in her arms, and the morning light beginning in the window, before she looked up. He stopped at the side of the bed. He looked at the child. He was not still in the way he was usually still. He was still in a different way, the stillness of someone who has arrived at something they had been moving toward, without fully knowing they were moving toward it, and who is now standing in front of it, and has no category for it. She looked at his face. He looked the way someone looks when the frame they have built for themselves, the controlled one, the iron one, the one that had held them together through 7 years of difficulty, encounters something for which the frame was never designed, not breaking, just encountering a thing that is larger than the frame without being frightened of it, taking it in. He looked at the child for a long time, then he looked at her. She held out the child toward him. He reached out and took it, carefully, with the focused attention of someone who genuinely could not afford to do this wrong. The child settled into his arms. He looked down at it. She watched his face. She had seen him in many conditions over the past months. She had seen him controlled and tired and thoughtful, and occasionally something close to warm. She had seen him consider hard things and make difficult decisions, and sit in her small room and reach across a table and say things that cost him something to say. She had seen him stop in corridors outside her door and start walking again. She had seen the almost not quite shift in his expression that she had been cataloging from the first day. She had not seen this. It was not soft exactly. It was not sentimental. It was something more fundamental than either of those words. The kind of thing that happens to a person when they encounter something that reorganizes, quietly and completely, the hierarchy of what matters. He looked at the child in his arms with the expression of a man who has just understood something that all the governance and strategy and iron control of his life had been, in some way, preparation for, without him knowing it. He looked up at her. She looked back at him. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, in the way it always was, but different from the way it always was, stripped of the final layer of control that usually lived under everything else, the layer he kept for himself. He said, "You did not have to come here." She looked at him. She understood what he meant. Not here to this room, not here to this morning, here to this territory, this castle, this life. She understood that he meant, "You could have died without telling me. You could have taken this and kept it, and I would have never known." She said, "I know." He said, "I am glad you did not." She said, "I know that too." He looked at the child again. He looked at it with that expression she had no word for, and was not sure she needed one, and he held it with the careful reverence of someone who understands, in the way that can only be understood by actually holding it, what they have been protecting all along. Clara left quietly. The healer's assistants left. The room grew very still. The morning light was coming through the window now, proper morning light, the light of the first genuinely warm day of the season, falling across the floor in long pale lines that were nothing like the cold white light of the throne hall, where she had first walked through those enormous doors in chains. This was warmer. This was different. Calum sat down beside the bed, still holding the child, and looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said. She waited. He said, "About what you said, on the night of the first snowfall, that it was because of me." She looked at him. "I remember saying it." "I want to tell you something," he said, in the same terms. She waited again. He said, "I went to the forest that night because I was sitting with a question I could not answer, in any room in this castle. The question was whether the person I had become in 7 years of making necessary choices was still someone I recognized." He looked at the child for a moment, then back at her. "I sat in the forest in the dark, and I found someone I recognized. I did not know what to do with that. I left before I could think about it too carefully." He paused. "I have been thinking about it for 8 months." She looked at him. She thought about the letter she had written, and refolded, and put in the drawer of the writing table. She thought about, "I had a direction, but not a destination." She said, "And?" He said, "And I recognize you, not just from the forest, from everything since, from every conversation, and every argument, and every moment in that room." He held her gaze. "You are the answer to the question I could not answer in any room in this castle." She breathed. The morning light was in the room, and the fire was still warm, and the child was in his arms, and she was looking at him, and she was alive. in a way that was different from the alive she had been doing for the past 8 months, the surviving kind. This was the other kind, the kind she had told him she wanted, that night in the chair by the fire, when he had asked what she wanted, and she had been surprised by the question. She said, "You should know that I am going to continue to tell you when you are wrong." He looked at her with that almost not quite thing that she had catalogued from the very first day and had been watching grow into something unmistakable over months of firelit evenings. "I am counting on it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The child made a small sound between them, and they both looked at it, and then looked back at each other, and neither of them looked away. Outside the window, the garden was coming back. The bare branches had been putting out their first tentative green for the past week, and the stone path was clear of snow, and the single stone bench near the center was catching the morning light. She had stood at that window on the first morning she was in this room, and looked at the bare bones of it, and thought about what it might look like in spring. It looked the way she had imagined. Better, actually. It often was, she was learning. Better than imagined, when you waited long enough and paid enough attention. She looked at Caleb and the child, and the morning light, and the warm room, and she thought about the dungeon, and the execution platform, and the border forest, and the fire, and the long, terrible weeks in between, and all the small decisions she had made. To stay quiet, to stay upright, to stay honest, to stay present. And she thought that this was where all of that had been going. Not the throne, not the title Lord Brennan was already drafting the documents for. Not the court, which was still adjusting, still finding its shape around the new reality. Not any of those things, which were real, but which were not this. This. A room with a window. A man with a child in his arms. A morning that was the first of something. She pressed her hand to her own heart, just for a moment. Then she reached out and touched the child's small hand, and it closed around her finger with the absolute unconscious grip of someone who had not yet learned to be careful about what they held on to. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her. He had been watching her. She said, "We are going to be all right." He said, "Yes." Not with ceremony. Not with the weight of a king making a declaration. With the simple, direct honesty of someone who meant what they said, and said exactly what they meant. "Yes," he said again. "We are." The morning went on. The garden was green at its edges, and white at its center, where the last of the season's cold was still melting from the stone, and the first birds were beginning in the trees beyond the wall, and the Iron Moon Castle was awake around them, and in a small room with a window and a fire, something real was breathing. It had started in a forest in the dark. It was still going,